The December wind howled against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Sterling and Associates like a banshee announcing Judgment Day, its icy fingers rattling the glass that separated the living from the ghosts of their past. Inside the mahogany-paneled conference room on the 32nd floor, the air hung thick with the scent of old leather, fresh coffee, and the particular tension that accompanies the reading of a will, that moment when love, greed, and family secrets collide in a symphony of revelation. Lake Michigan stretched endlessly beyond the windows, its gray waters churning like the emotions that would soon erupt in this very room. The city below moved with its usual winter urgency, unaware that in this oak-lined sanctuary, a family's carefully constructed world was about to shatter like ice beneath a sledgehammer. Eleanor Thorne sat at the head of the imposing conference table, her steel-gray hair pulled back in a chignon that had remained unchanged for the past 2 decades, much like her unwavering composure in moments such as these. At 67, she had presided over enough family destructions to recognize the warning signs, the way fingers drummed against mahogany, the barely contained impatience masked as grief, the calculating glances exchanged when they thought no one was watching. Her wire-rimmed glasses reflected the winter light as she arranged the documents before her with the precision of a surgeon preparing for a delicate operation. To her right sat Marcus Delacroix, 45 years of success wrapped in a charcoal Armani suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent. His jaw, sharp enough to cut glass, was set in that familiar expression of controlled authority that had served him well in Chicago's financial district. Dark hair, touched with distinguished silver at the temples, framed a face that bore his mother's strong cheekbones but none of her warmth. His fingers, manicured and adorned with a platinum wedding band, tapped an impatient rhythm against the table's surface, a metronome marking the seconds until his inheritance would be officially confirmed. Beside him, Celeste Delacroix perched like an elegant bird of prey, her blonde hair styled in perfect waves that had required 2 hours at the salon that morning. At 42, she possessed the kind of polished beauty that money could buy and careful breeding could refine. Her cerulean blue dress, chosen specifically for its respectful yet striking appearance, complemented the sapphire necklace that had been her mother-in-law's, though Rosa had never actually given it to her. Celeste had simply claimed it from the jewelry box after the funeral, reasoning that it would eventually be hers anyway. Across the table, 17-year-old Sophia Delacroix fidgeted in her chair, her dark eyes, so like her grandmother Rosa's, darting between the adults with the uncomfortable awareness that something significant was happening, though she couldn't quite grasp what. Unlike her parents' designer attire, she wore a simple black dress and her grandmother's silver cross, the one Rosa had pressed into her hands during their last visit. Para que me recuerdes, Rosa had whispered, though Sophia's Spanish was limited to menu items and embarrassed exchanges with the restaurant staff. At the far end of the table, David Delacroix sat like a shadow of his older brother's success. At 38, he possessed the same strong features as Marcus, but life had carved different stories into his face, lines born of struggle rather than boardroom battles, eyes that held the particular weariness of dreams deferred and demons conquered. His thrift store blazer and faded jeans marked him as the family's black sheep, the artist who had disappointed Rosa by choosing paint over profit, creativity over the family business. His hands, stained with oils and charcoal, trembled slightly, whether from grief, withdrawal, or anticipation, no one could say. Eleanor cleared her throat, the sound slicing through the heavy silence like a gavel calling court to order. Ladies and gentlemen, we're gathered here today to execute the last will and testament of Rosa Maria Delacroix, who passed peacefully in her sleep on November 28 at the age of 78. The words hung in the air like incense, each syllable a reminder of the woman who had built an empire from nothing more than determination and the secrets of her grandmother's recipes. Rosa Delacroix, born Rosa Maria Santos in a village outside Guadalajara, had transformed herself from a frightened 18-year-old immigrant into the matriarch of Chicago's most successful Mexican restaurant chain. Rosa's Kitchen wasn't just a business, it was a testament to the American dream wrapped in the flavors of home. Rosa was a woman of extraordinary vision and even more extraordinary heart, Eleanor continued, her voice carrying the weight of 30 years of friendship and professional relationship. She entrusted me with her final wishes, which I will now read verbatim, as was her express instruction. Marcus leaned forward, his entire body coiled with anticipation. He had been groomed for this moment since childhood, trained to inherit not just money but legacy. The restaurants, the real estate, the investment portfolio, all of it represented validation of his mother's faith in him, proof that her sacrifices had meaning. He thought of the expansion plans already drawn up, the corporate investors eager to modernize the brand, the fortune that would finally cement his place among Chicago's financial elite. First, Eleanor began, her voice steady as a judge pronouncing sentence, to my beloved staff at Rosa's Kitchen, particularly Carmen Rodriguez, who has managed my flagship restaurant for 15 years, I bequeath the sum of $25,000 each, along with my eternal gratitude for their devotion to preserving the heart of what we built together. A murmur of approval rippled through the room. Even Marcus nodded approvingly. These were reasonable gestures, the kind of magnanimous bequests that reflected well on the family's generosity. To the Guadalajara Children's Foundation, I leave $50,000 to be used for educational scholarships for young women seeking to build better lives in America. Again, nods of approval. Rosa had always been charitable, sometimes to Marcus's frustration when he felt her donations could have been invested more strategically. To my younger son, David, I leave the sum of $50,000, along with the deed to the building that currently houses his art studio, so that he may continue to create beauty in this world without the burden of rent consuming his dreams. David's intake of breath was audible in the silent room. $50,000 represented more money than he had ever possessed at one time, and the studio, the converted warehouse space in Pilsen where he had been month to month for 3 years, suddenly becoming his own seemed impossible. Tears gathered in his eyes as he whispered, "Mama," using the name he hadn't spoken since childhood. To my granddaughter Sophia, I establish an education trust fund of $100,000 to be used for college tuition and expenses, with the stipulation that she spend at least one semester studying abroad in Mexico, connecting with the roots that flow in her blood whether she acknowledges them or not. Sophia's hand flew to the silver cross at her throat, finally understanding why Rosa had been so insistent about her learning Spanish, why she had pressed family photos into her hands and spoken of cousins in villages whose names Sophia couldn't pronounce. Marcus's smile grew broader with each bequest. These were all reasonable, expected gifts, generous but not extravagant. The real fortune, the core of Rosa's $15 million estate, remained untouched. The restaurants, the properties, the investment portfolio, the family home in Lincoln Park, all of it waited for his name to be spoken. "And now," Eleanor said, pausing to adjust her glasses with the deliberate care of someone who understood the magnitude of the moment, "the remainder of my estate, including all business assets, real estate holdings, investment portfolios, and personal effects, shall pass in its entirety to." The room held its collective breath. Marcus's hands gripped the table edge, his knuckles white with anticipation. Celeste's eyes gleamed with the satisfaction of a plan finally coming to fruition. Even David leaned forward, expecting to hear his brother's name spoken with the weight of destiny. Maria Elena Santos. The silence that followed was absolute, as if the very air had been sucked from the room. For a moment, no one moved, no one breathed, no one spoke. The words seemed to hang in the space above the table like a spell waiting to be broken. Then Marcus exploded. "What did you say?" His voice erupted like a volcano, raw and primal, echoing off the mahogany panels. He shot to his feet so violently that his chair toppled backward, crashing to the floor with a sound like breaking bones. "She gave everything to WHO? The maid?" His face had gone from pale to crimson in the span of seconds, veins standing out at his temples like road maps of rage. His hands shook as he pointed an accusing finger at Eleanor, spittle flying from his lips as he continued his tirade. "This is impossible. This is fraud. That gold-digging witch, that nobody, manipulated my mother. She was senile, she wasn't thinking clearly." His voice cracked on the last words, raw emotion breaking through his carefully constructed facade. Celeste's perfectly manicured hand flew to her throat, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. "Marcus, this can't be real. Your mother wouldn't, she couldn't." "Maria Santos," Eleanor repeated calmly, consulting her notes with the unflappable composure of someone who had witnessed such explosions many times before. Currently residing at 2847 West Armitage Avenue, Apartment 3B. Previously employed as household staff by the Delacroix family from 1995 to 2020. The maid! Marcus screamed again, his voice breaking like an adolescent boy's. She gave our fortune, our inheritance, to the goddamn maid. David sat frozen in his chair, his artistic mind trying to process what he had just heard. Maria, quiet, devoted Maria who had been more mother to him during his darkest years than anyone else. Maria who had cleaned up his vomit when he was detoxing, who had made him soup when he was too depressed to eat, who had never once judged him for his failures. Sophia's eyes were wide with confusion and something that might have been understanding. "Wait," she said softly, her young voice cutting through her father's rage. "Tia Maria? But she's family. Abuela always said. She's not family." Marcus whirled on his daughter, his fury now directed at anyone within reach. "She's hired help. She's a servant who somehow conned your grandmother into giving away everything we worked for." Eleanor's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. "Mr. Delacroix, I must ask you to compose yourself." Rosa specified that this decision was made of her own free will, with full mental capacity, and that any legal challenge to the will would result in the disputed portion being donated in its entirety to immigration advocacy organizations. The threat hung in the air like a sword over Marcus's head. He stood there, chest heaving, his entire world crumbling around him like a house of cards in a hurricane. The restaurants he had planned to expand and modernize. The real estate portfolio he had intended to liquidate. The investment accounts that would have made him independently wealthy. All of it, gone. Given to a woman he had barely acknowledged as human. "This isn't over," he growled, his voice low and dangerous. "I'll contest this. I'll prove she was coerced, manipulated. No court in America will let a fortune pass to." "To whom, Mr. Delacroix?" Eleanor's steel-gray eyes fixed on him with the intensity of a prosecutor making a closing argument. "To a woman who devoted 25 years of her life to caring for your mother? Who was there every day during Rosa's final illness while where were you, exactly?" The question landed like a physical blow. Marcus had visited his mother perhaps once a month in her final year, always with an excuse about work, about obligations, about the demands of his important life. It had been Maria who had held Rosa's hand during chemotherapy, Maria who had slept on the floor beside her bed when the pain was too much, Maria who had been the last face Rosa saw when she closed her eyes forever. The room fell silent except for the wind howling against the windows and the sound of Marcus's ragged breathing. In that silence, the magnitude of what had just transpired began to settle over them like ash from a distant fire. Everything they had assumed about their future, about their security, about their place in the world, had just been swept away by the reading of a name that none of them had expected to hear. Maria Elena Santos. The maid who had become the heiress to a fortune built on recipes, dreams, and the kind of love that transcends blood. The silence in Eleanor's office stretched like a taut wire, ready to snap under the weight of revelation. But to understand the earthquake that had just shattered the Delacroix family, one must travel back through time, back to when Rosa Maria Santos first set foot on American soil with nothing but a cardboard suitcase, a rosary blessed by her village priest, and a secret growing beneath her heart. Chicago in February 1965 was a city of smoke and ambition, where the wind off Lake Michigan cut through dreams as easily as it sliced through flesh. Rosa Maria Santos stepped off the Greyhound bus at Union Station, 18 years old and 5 months pregnant, her dark hair braided with ribbons that had lost their color during the 3-day journey from the border. The father of her child, a charming boy from the neighboring village who had promised marriage and delivered only heartbreak, was nothing more than a painful memory she carried alongside the new life in her womb. Her English consisted of 20 words learned from a battered phrase book, her money amounted to $37 sewn into the lining of her coat, and her only contact in this vast, intimidating city was her cousin Elena, who had written sporadically about work cleaning houses for rich families in neighborhoods Rosa couldn't pronounce. Elena lived in a tenement building in Pilsen, where Spanish flowed like water through paper-thin walls and the smell of fresh tortillas mixed with industrial smoke from the nearby factories. She was a practical woman of 42 who had learned that survival in America required calloused hands and a closed mouth. When Rosa arrived at her door, belly round beneath her threadbare coat, Elena's expression shifted from surprise to resignation. "Why El Padre?" she asked, though she already knew the answer from Rosa's lowered eyes. "No hey Padre," Rosa whispered, the words tasting like ash. "There is no father." Elena nodded grimly. "Entonces, hey que trabajar. We work." Within a week, Rosa found herself standing in the marble foyer of a Gold Coast mansion, wearing Elena's spare uniform and clutching a list of cleaning supplies she couldn't read. Mrs. Hamilton Price, the lady of the house, was a woman who wore her wealth like armor, inspecting Rosa with the same dispassion she might reserve for examining produce at the market. "She speaks English?" Mrs. Hamilton Price asked Elena, as if Rosa were invisible. "She learns fast," Elena replied in careful English. "Very good worker." Rosa spent 6 days a week in that house, learning that marble showed every fingerprint, that crystal required special cloths, and that wealthy people generated messes with the casual indifference of those who had never cleaned up after themselves. Her pregnancy began to show, and Mrs. Hamilton Price's disapproval grew with Rosa's belly. "I can't have pregnant help waddling around my house," she declared one morning in March. "It's unseemly." Rosa understood enough to know she was being dismissed. She gathered her few possessions and walked out into the gray Chicago morning, $24 poorer but infinitely wiser about the casual cruelty of the privileged. Marcus Robert Delacroix was born on a sweltering July night in 1966, in the charity ward of Cook County Hospital. Rosa labored for 18 hours, clutching Elena's hand and praying to the Virgin of Guadalupe for strength. When the nurse finally placed her son in her arms, his dark hair still slick from birth, Rosa looked into his eyes and made a promise that would shape the rest of her life. "Tu vas a ser alguien importante," she whispered against his tiny forehead. "You will be someone important." With a newborn to support, Rosa took any work she could find. She cleaned offices at night while Marcus slept in a basket beside her mop bucket. She worked in restaurant kitchens during lunch rushes, learning the rhythm of commercial cooking while Marcus played with spoons and measuring cups on the floor. She took in ironing and mending, her fingers flying over other people's clothes while Marcus napped in a laundry basket lined with soft towels. But it was during her stint as a housekeeper for the Kowalski family that Rosa's true calling revealed itself. Mrs. Kowalski, a grandmother of Polish descent, was hosting her daughter's wedding reception and found herself overwhelmed by the catering arrangements. "The caterer canceled last minute," she confided to Rosa, tears of frustration in her eyes. 50 people coming tomorrow, and I have nothing." Rosa's response was instinctive. "I can cook." What followed was a 20-hour marathon of preparation that began with Rosa's own grocery money and ended with a feast that had wedding guests begging for recipes. Pozole that transported Mexican relatives to their childhood kitchens. Carnitas so tender they dissolved on the tongue. Tamales wrapped with the precision of love letters. Wedding cake tres leches that made grown men weep with joy. Mrs. Kowalski pressed an extra $100 into Rosa's hands at the end of the night. "You should do this professionally," she said. "You have a gift." That night, as Rosa counted the money while Marcus slept beside her, she felt something she hadn't experienced since leaving Mexico: hope. By 1970, Rosa's Catering operated out of Rosa's tenement kitchen, with a reputation that spread through Chicago's working-class neighborhoods like whispered prayers. She cooked for quinceañeras and weddings, funeral receptions and baptism parties, each event building her reputation one satisfied customer at a time. Rosa invested every penny back into the business: better equipment, more elaborate dishes, printed business cards with her name in elegant script. She learned English by watching cooking shows and reading recipes, her vocabulary expanding from survival words to the poetry of cuisine. Marcus, now 4, would sit at the kitchen table doing puzzles while Rosa prepped vegetables, absorbing the rhythm of her work like a lullaby. It was at a St. Valentine's Day catering job at a small accounting firm that Rosa met Robert Delacroix. He was a gentleman of 35, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and hands that were soft from pushing papers rather than hard from labor. While his colleagues devoured Rosa's food with typical masculine efficiency, Robert approached her in the kitchen. "Excuse me," he said, his voice careful and respectful. "I wanted to tell you that was the best meal I've had since my grandmother passed. She was from Louisiana, could make magic with rice and beans. This reminded me of her." Rosa looked up from her cleanup, surprised by his sincerity. Most clients paid and dismissed her without acknowledgement. "Thank you, Senor." "Robert," he corrected gently. "And you're Rosa? I saw your name on the business cards." Their courtship was slow and respectful, conducted in the margins of Rosa's impossible schedule. Robert would appear at her catering jobs, ostensibly to check on accounting details for the businesses she served, but really to steal moments of conversation. He learned that she was raising her son alone, that she dreamed of opening a real restaurant, that she sent money home to Mexico every month despite barely having enough for herself. Robert saw in Rosa something that reminded him of his own grandmother's resilience. His family had been Cajun sharecroppers who had lost everything in the Depression, and he understood the particular hunger that drove people to build something from nothing. When he proposed in 1972, it wasn't with flowery declarations of passion but with a practical offer of partnership. "I know about business," he said, sitting in Rosa's tiny kitchen while 6-year-old Marcus colored at the table. "You know about dreams. Together, maybe we can build something that lasts." Their wedding was small, Elena and a few friends, Robert's elderly aunt from New Orleans, and Marcus in a tiny suit that Rosa had sewn herself. They honeymooned by driving to look at potential restaurant locations, Rosa's pregnant belly brushing against the steering wheel as they toured empty storefronts. David was born in 1973, a quieter child than Marcus, with Robert's gentle eyes and Rosa's artistic sensibilities. Where Marcus had been drawn to numbers and order even as a toddler, David was fascinated by colors and shapes, spending hours drawing elaborate pictures while Rosa cooked. Rosa's Kitchen opened its doors on November 1, 1974, in a narrow storefront in Pilsen with 12 tables, a kitchen barely large enough for 2 cooks, and a dream that had taken nearly a decade to realize. Robert had mortgaged everything they owned, and Rosa had sold her grandmother's wedding ring, the only valuable thing she had brought from Mexico, to cover the final costs. The restaurant's first year was a testament to Rosa's relentless work ethic and Robert's careful financial management. Rosa cooked from dawn until midnight, her hands never stopping their dance of chopping, stirring, seasoning. Robert handled the books, the permits, the endless bureaucracy that threatened to strangle small businesses. Marcus, now 8, would do his homework at table 12, learning multiplication while the scent of chiles and cumin filled his lungs. David, barely walking, explored the restaurant like it was his personal playground, charming customers with his shy smiles. Success came slowly, then suddenly. Food critics discovered Rosa's Kitchen in 1976, writing rapturous reviews about authentic Mexican cuisine served with immigrant soul. Lines began forming outside the door. Reservations became necessary. By 1978, Rosa was looking at property for a second location. But success exacted its price. Robert, never robust, began showing signs of strain. The long hours, the financial pressure, the constant stress of expansion, it all took its toll on a man whose constitution was better suited for quiet accounting than restaurant warfare. He developed chest pains in 1979, dismissed as heartburn. His doctor prescribed rest that he couldn't afford to take. Marcus, now 13, had absorbed his father's business acumen and his mother's work ethic, but tempered with an ambition that sometimes worried Rosa. He talked about franchising, about corporate expansion, about scaling the brand in language that sounded foreign in Rosa's Kitchen. David, at 6, remained lost in his artistic world, creating elaborate murals on the restaurant's walls that delighted customers but puzzled his business-minded brother. Robert's heart attack came without warning on a Tuesday morning in March 1980. He collapsed in the restaurant office, surrounded by receipts and inventory lists, the numbers he had tended so carefully scattered across the floor like autumn leaves. Rosa found him there, still clutching a pencil, his last calculation incomplete. The funeral was a blur of flowers and condolences, of customers who had become friends offering comfort Rosa was too numb to accept. But even in her grief, Rosa knew that stopping was not an option. She had 2 sons to support, employees who depended on her, and a dream that Robert had died helping her build. At 13, Marcus stepped into his father's role with a composure that was both admirable and unnerving. He learned to balance books, to negotiate with suppliers, to speak to bank managers with an authority that belied his age. Teachers marveled at his business instincts, his ability to see profit margins and expansion opportunities where other teenagers saw only schoolwork. But something else was growing in Marcus alongside his business acumen, a subtle embarrassment about his origins that Rosa noticed but chose to ignore, hoping it was merely adolescent awkwardness. He began correcting Rosa's accent in front of customers, suggesting menu changes that would make the restaurant more accessible to mainstream tastes. When high school friends came to the restaurant, he served them quietly, efficiently, but without the pride that Rosa had hoped to see in her heir apparent. David, now 7, remained untouched by such concerns. He painted murals that told the story of Rosa's journey from Mexico to Chicago, vibrant scenes that customers photographed and food critics praised. But Marcus dismissed his brother's art as unprofessional decoration, already planning how he would modernize the restaurant's aesthetic when his time came to lead. Marcus graduated valedictorian from his high school in 1984, his acceptance to Northwestern University's business school arriving with a full scholarship that made Rosa weep with pride. She framed the acceptance letter alongside Robert's wedding ring and her first business license, the trinity of her American success story. At Northwestern, Marcus thrived in ways that took him further from Rosa's world with each passing semester. He studied corporate finance and marketing strategy, learning to speak the language of profit optimization and brand management. His classmates were the children of Chicago's elite, future inheritors of family fortunes that made Rosa's hard-won success seem quaint by comparison. It was during his junior year that Marcus met Celeste Morrison White, a sorority president from Lake Forest whose family owned a chain of high-end department stores. Celeste was everything Rosa was not: polished, connected, born into the kind of American aristocracy that regarded self-made fortunes with polite condescension. When Marcus brought her to meet Rosa, the dinner was a careful dance of cultural translation, with Marcus serving as interpreter between his mother's earthy warmth and his girlfriend's cool sophistication. "Your English is so good," Celeste told Rosa with the kind of breathless surprise usually reserved for talking parrots. "And the food is very authentic." Rosa smiled and nodded, but privately winced at the subtext. In Celeste's vocabulary, authentic meant charmingly primitive, suitable for occasional ethnic dining experiences but not the foundation of serious business. Marcus, sensing the tension, quickly steered conversation toward his expansion plans for Rosa's Kitchen, speaking of franchising opportunities and market penetration studies until Rosa felt like a stranger in her own restaurant. The transformation accelerated after Marcus's graduation in 1987. He joined Rosa's Kitchen officially as operations manager, bringing with him flowcharts and efficiency studies that turned the warm chaos of Rosa's Kitchen into something that resembled the corporate environments he had studied. Profit margins improved, but something ineffable was lost, the sense that each meal was a personal gift from Rosa to her customers. David, now 14, watched his brother's metamorphosis with the keen eye of an artist studying light and shadow. He began sketching Marcus in his new suits, capturing the subtle ways his elder brother was reshaping himself into someone their father wouldn't recognize. These sketches troubled Rosa, not because they were unkind, but because they were so perceptively accurate. Marcus and Celeste's wedding in 1990 was a Lake Forest affair that cost more than Rosa's Kitchen had grossed in its first year. Rosa wore a dress that Celeste had chosen for her, elegant, expensive, and utterly unlike anything she would have selected herself. She felt like an actor playing the role of the successful immigrant mother, performing for an audience that applauded her achievement while maintaining careful distance from its origins. The reception featured a carefully curated menu that included elevated versions of Rosa's recipes: duck carnitas with pomegranate molasses, lobster tamales with saffron masa. Rosa watched her life's work transformed into something she barely recognized, beautiful but bloodless, like flowers preserved under glass. David, 17 and increasingly aware of social nuances, served as Rosa's emotional barometer throughout the evening. He translated not just language but context, helping Rosa navigate conversations where her success was praised in ways that somehow felt diminishing. When one of Celeste's aunts complimented Rosa on overcoming such obstacles, David stepped in smoothly. "My mother didn't overcome obstacles," he said with quiet intensity. "She created opportunities. There's a difference." Rosa's heart swelled with pride for her younger son, even as she noticed Marcus's slight wince at the exchange. She was beginning to understand that her older son was walking a tightrope between two worlds, and that the weight of her love might be the very thing that threatened his balance. That night, lying in her bed above the restaurant where she had spent 25 years building her American dream, Rosa felt the first hairline crack in the foundation of everything she had constructed. Her golden boy, the son for whom she had sacrificed everything, was slipping away from her, not through rejection, but through transformation into someone she was no longer sure she recognized. The woman who had once promised an infant son that he would be someone important was beginning to wonder if, in achieving that goal, she had somehow lost the boy she had meant to save. The spring rain of 1995 drummed against the windows of Rosa's kitchen like fingertips tapping out a message in code, and perhaps it was a signal that the past was about to collide with the present in ways that would reshape everything Rosa had built. She was standing in the kitchen of her flagship restaurant, watching steam rise from a pot of pozole that had been simmering since dawn, when Elena burst through the back door with news that would change the trajectory of 3 generations. "Rosa, tiens que venir," Elena said breathlessly, water dripping from her coat onto the pristine tiles. "There's a girl at my apartment. From home. From the village." Rosa set down her wooden spoon with the careful precision of someone who had learned that sudden movements could shatter more than just pottery. "De nuestro pueblo?" "Sí, but Rosa." Elena's voice dropped to a whisper laden with significance. "She has Esperanza's eyes." The name hit Rosa like a physical blow. Esperanza, her younger sister, lost to a fever when Rosa was 16. The sister who had been going to follow Rosa to America, who had died clutching a letter Rosa had sent describing the golden opportunities waiting across the border. Rosa had carried the guilt of that unfulfilled promise for 30 years, a weight that had only grown heavier with each success that Esperanza would never share. "Impossible," Rosa breathed, but her hands were already reaching for her coat. Maria Elena Santos was huddled in Elena's kitchen like a broken bird, her dark hair hanging in damp curtains around a face that was indeed hauntingly familiar. At 22, she possessed the same delicate bone structure that Rosa remembered in Esperanza, the same way of holding her chin when frightened, lifted just enough to suggest dignity even in defeat. Her clothes were cheap and travel-stained, and she clutched a cardboard suitcase that looked older than she was. But it was her condition that made Rosa's breath catch. Maria was perhaps 6 months pregnant, her belly round beneath a coat that had seen better decades, and her eyes held the particular exhaustion of someone who had run out of places to run. "Señora," Maria whispered when Rosa entered, struggling to rise from the kitchen chair. "Elena says you might." "I can work. I'm strong. I can clean, I can cook a little." "Scientate, Mija," Rosa said gently, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to caring for strays. "Sit. Tell me your story." What emerged over the next hour was a tale that could have been Rosa's own story, told 30 years later with different details but the same desperate hope. Maria Santos was the granddaughter of Esperanza's eldest daughter, Luz, a connection Rosa hadn't even known existed. Luz had died when Maria was 15, but not before telling her about the sister who had gone to America and made something of herself. She said if I ever needed help, if things got bad enough, I should find Rosa who makes the best carnitas in Chicago, Maria said with a weak smile that transformed her entire face. She said family doesn't forget family, even across borders. The things getting bad enough had arrived in the form of Maria's husband, Diego, a man whose charming courtship had concealed a vicious temper that revealed itself only after their wedding. The bruises on Maria's arms told a story she didn't need to speak aloud, and Rosa's experienced eye caught the way she flinched from sudden movements, the way she positioned herself near the door even in this safe kitchen. He doesn't know about the baby, Maria said quietly, her hand resting protectively on her belly. I left before he could hurt us both. Rosa felt something shift in her chest, a recognition that went deeper than shared DNA. This girl was Esperanza's granddaughter, yes, but she was also Rosa's own ghost, the frightened 18-year-old who had arrived in Chicago 30 years ago with nothing but hope and determination. You have a place here, Rosa said simply. Work, yes, but more than that. Family. What began as temporary employment evolved into something far more complex over the following months. Rosa installed Maria in the apartment above the restaurant's second location, the same space where she herself had lived during the early years of expansion. She found work for Maria that went beyond simple housekeeping, inventory management, customer service, gradually training her in the rhythms of restaurant operations. But Rosa was careful, perhaps too careful, about the nature of their relationship. Marcus, now 29 and increasingly involved in the business's strategic decisions, watched his mother's attention to the new girl with growing suspicion. To him, Maria represented everything he was trying to distance the family from: recent immigration, limited English, the kind of obvious need that reminded customers that Rosa's kitchen had humble origins. She's efficient enough, Marcus conceded during one of their weekly business meetings, but mother, people talk. They wonder why you're so invested in her success. Rosa's eyes flashed with an anger that Marcus had rarely seen directed at him. People talk? What people? And what exactly do they say? They say you're playing favorites. That you're setting a precedent for other employees to expect special treatment. Marcus's voice carried the smooth authority he had learned in business school, but Rosa heard the echo of Celeste's opinions beneath his words. Maria works harder than anyone else on staff. She's here before dawn, she stays after closing. If that's favoritism, then perhaps the other employees should ask themselves what they're really contributing. But Rosa knew the criticism cut deeper than professional jealousy. Maria represented a connection to the past that Marcus was systematically trying to erase. Her presence reminded customers and investors that Rosa's Kitchen wasn't just a successful restaurant chain but the product of immigrant struggle. In Marcus's vision of corporate expansion, such authenticity was a liability to be managed, not an asset to be celebrated. Meanwhile, David, now 22 and struggling through his final year at art school, found in Maria a kindred spirit who understood what it meant to feel displaced in your own life. His battles with substance abuse had begun in college, first alcohol to quiet the anxiety of being Robert Delacroix's sensitive son in a world that valued Marcus's aggressive ambition, then harder drugs when alcohol stopped working. Rosa knew about David's struggles, had known from the first time she found pills in his jacket pocket, had known from the way his art grew darker and more fragmented. She paid for rehab programs that David attended dutifully and left unchanged. She hired private therapists who declared him resistant to treatment. She watched her younger son disappear into addiction while feeling helpless to pull him back. It was Maria who finally reached him, not through intervention or confrontation, but through simple, consistent presence. She would sit with him during his bad days, speaking softly in Spanish about her own struggles with Diego's violence, about the ways trauma could make you betray yourself. She understood that addiction wasn't moral failure but a form of self-protection that had outlived its usefulness. Your mother loves you the way she loves her recipes, Maria told David one evening as they sat in the empty restaurant, watching him sketch while she counted register receipts. She wants to fix the ingredients, make everything perfect. But some things can't be fixed. They can only be accepted and loved. Rosa watched these interactions with a mixture of gratitude and heartbreak. Maria was giving David something she couldn't: acceptance without expectations, love without the weight of unfulfilled dreams. Isabella Santos was born on a January morning in 1996, during a blizzard that shut down most of Chicago but couldn't stop Rosa from pacing the maternity ward at Cook County Hospital. She had been present for the birth in ways that Maria's own family couldn't be, holding her hand during contractions, translating between Spanish and English when medical terminology became too complex, serving as both advocate and anchor during the most vulnerable hours of Maria's life. When the nurse placed Isabella in Rosa's arms for the first time, something fundamental shifted in the older woman's heart. This child, with her dark hair and rosebud mouth, represented more than just her employee's daughter. She was the continuation of Esperanza's line, the living proof that family could survive separation, poverty, and loss to find each other again across decades and borders. "She looks like you did as a baby," Rosa whispered to Maria, who was exhausted but radiant in the hospital bed. "Esperanza used to say you had the same serious expression, like you were already planning your next move." Rosa became Isabella's unofficial grandmother with an intensity that surprised even her. She arranged her work schedule around the baby's needs, converting a corner of the restaurant's office into an impromptu nursery where Isabella could sleep while Maria worked. She taught Isabella Spanish lullabies that her own mother had sung, stories about the village where 3 generations of Santos women had been born. Marcus watched this development with increasing alarm. His mother's devotion to Maria and Isabella was becoming impossible to ignore, and customers had begun commenting on the baby who charmed them from her high chair while Maria served tables. In Marcus's corporate vision, children in restaurants represented liability and unprofessionalism. But when he suggested that Maria find alternative childcare, Rosa's response was swift and final. "Isabella stays. If you have a problem with that, you can find another job." The threat was delivered with the quiet authority of someone who still owned 100% of Rosa's kitchen, despite Marcus's assumptions about his inheritance. For the first time in years, Marcus was reminded that his position in the company was a gift, not a right. Celeste, pregnant with Sophia, watched Rosa's devotion to Isabella with poorly concealed resentment. Here was her mother-in-law pouring the kind of grandmotherly attention into a housekeeper's child that she was already envisioning for her own baby. When Sophia was born 6 months later, the contrast became even more stark. Rosa loved her granddaughter, certainly, but there was something different about her relationship with Isabella, more natural, less performed. "It's like she's replacing us," Celeste confided to Marcus one evening as they watched Rosa teach 2-year-old Isabella to pat masa for tortillas while 4-year-old Sophia sat ignored at a nearby table. "Your daughter is right there, and she's playing with the maid's kid." Marcus began documenting what he saw as his mother's preferential treatment of Maria and Isabella. He hired consultants to evaluate restaurant operations, hoping to find evidence that Maria's presence was negatively impacting efficiency or profitability. He suggested policy changes that would make it difficult for employees to bring children to work. He even quietly explored legal options for challenging what he saw as the inappropriate mixing of business and personal relationships. But Rosa was building something that transcended Marcus's understanding of professional boundaries. Maria wasn't just an employee, she was the daughter Rosa had never had, the continuation of family lines that had been severed by poverty and circumstance. Isabella wasn't just a child in the restaurant, she was the future Rosa was determined to protect and nurture. As the years passed, Maria evolved from housekeeper to restaurant manager to Rosa's most trusted advisor. She understood the business in ways that Marcus, for all his MBA training, never had. Maria knew which customers preferred their salsa mild despite ordering it hot, which servers were struggling with personal problems that affected their work, which suppliers could be trusted during shortages. She moved through Rosa's kitchen like someone who had grown up there, reading the rhythms of service with intuitive precision. More importantly, she understood Rosa's vision in ways that her own sons increasingly didn't. When Marcus proposed franchising deals that would require standardizing recipes and eliminating regional variations, Maria was the one who explained why such changes would destroy the restaurant's soul. When food consultants suggested menu modifications to appeal to broader demographics, Maria helped Rosa articulate why authenticity couldn't be compromised for profit. "They want to turn our family recipes into fast food," Maria said during one particularly contentious business meeting in 2005. "They want to take out the love and replace it with efficiency." Marcus's frustration with Maria's influence had grown into something approaching hatred. She represented everything he was trying to modernize away: the personal relationships that complicated corporate structures, the ethnic authenticity that limited expansion opportunities, the emotional decision-making that interfered with profit optimization. "She's a housekeeper," he told David during one of their increasingly rare conversations. "A housekeeper who somehow convinced our mother to make her a business partner. It's inappropriate, it's unprofessional, and it's going to destroy everything we've built." David, clean for 2 years and working as a designer for a small advertising firm, saw the situation with the clarity that often comes from having survived your own worst impulses. Maybe the problem isn't that Maria has too much influence. Maybe the problem is that you've lost sight of what we actually built. The comment stung because it contained truth Marcus wasn't ready to acknowledge. Somewhere in his journey from Rosa's son to corporate executive, he had stopped seeing Rosa's kitchen as the embodiment of his mother's dreams and started seeing it as an asset to be leveraged. Maria, with her fierce protection of tradition and her deep understanding of what the restaurants meant to their community, represented an obstacle to his vision of expansion and modernization. Meanwhile, Isabella grew up thinking of Rosa as her abuela in truth as well as affection. She spent afternoons at the restaurant doing homework while Rosa cooked, learning to fold napkins and arrange flowers, absorbing the rhythms of hospitality as naturally as breathing. Rosa taught her the stories behind each recipe: how the mole had been perfected through 7 generations of Santos women, how the carnitas technique had been adapted for Chicago's climate, how each dish carried the memory of home across the borders of geography and time. By 2010, when Isabella was 14, she was fluent in both the Spanish of her mother's village and the English of her Chicago childhood. She moved between worlds with the ease of someone who had never been forced to choose between them, translating not just languages but cultures for customers who appreciated the restaurant's authenticity without always understanding its origins. Rosa watched Isabella's growth with the satisfaction of someone who had successfully passed down something precious. In this child, she saw the continuation of everything she valued: family loyalty, cultural pride, the understanding that business success meant nothing if it came at the cost of identity. Marcus watched the same development with growing alarm. Isabella represented the future of Rosa's kitchen in ways that marginalized his own children. Sophia, now a teenager, showed little interest in the restaurant business beyond the money it provided for her private school tuition. But Isabella spoke of the restaurants as ours, helped train new servers, suggested menu improvements based on customer feedback she had overheard. The divide in the family had become a chasm, with Rosa and Maria on one side protecting tradition and authenticity, and Marcus on the other side pushing for modernization and expansion. David found himself caught between them, understanding both perspectives but increasingly aligned with his mother's vision of preserving what mattered most. The stage was set for a battle over the soul of Rosa's kitchen, a battle that would ultimately be decided not in boardrooms or business meetings, but in the careful words of a will that would reveal where Rosa's deepest loyalties truly lay. In the quiet moments between service rushes, Rosa would watch Maria efficiently managing staff while Isabella charmed customers with her bilingual warmth, and she would feel the deep satisfaction of someone who had successfully completed a circle that had been broken for 30 years. Family had found family. Love had been preserved and passed down. The recipes would survive, along with the stories that gave them meaning. Marcus saw the same scenes and felt the ground shifting beneath his feet, not yet understanding that he was witnessing not just the success of his mother's business, but the victory of her deepest values over his own narrow ambitions. The stroke came to Rosa like a thief in the night, stealing into her sleep on a humid August evening in 2015 when the city shimmered with heat mirages and the promise of autumn seemed impossibly distant. She woke in Cook County Hospital 3 days later to find Marcus sitting beside her bed, his expensive suit wrinkled from what appeared to be a lengthy vigil, though Rosa would later learn he had arrived only an hour before her awakening. Don't try to talk, Mother, he said, his voice carrying the gentle authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. The doctors say you've had a minor stroke. Left side weakness, some speech difficulty. But you're going to be fine. Rosa tried to speak and found her words emerging thick and clumsy, like trying to talk through molasses. Her left hand, which had wielded knives and wooden spoons with artistic precision for 60 years, lay on the hospital blanket like a dead thing. Terror gripped her, not of death, which she had made peace with long ago, but of helplessness, of losing control over the empire she had built with her own hands. I've taken care of everything, Marcus continued, producing a folder of legal documents with the efficiency of someone who had been planning for this moment. Power of attorney, medical decisions, business operations. You don't need to worry about anything except getting better. What Rosa couldn't know in her medication-clouded state, was that Marcus had been preparing for this opportunity for years. The power of attorney documents had been drafted by his personal lawyer, not the family attorney who had handled Rosa's affairs for decades. The business arrangements gave him sweeping authority over Rosa's kitchen operations, including personnel decisions and financial management. Maria arrived at the hospital still wearing her flour-dusted apron, having run directly from the kitchen when David called with the news. She found Rosa struggling to communicate, tears of frustration streaming down her face as she tried to explain something urgent, something important that Marcus seemed determined not to understand. "Senora Rosa, I'm here," Maria whispered, taking Rosa's working hand in both of hers. "Isabella and we're not going anywhere. The restaurants are running perfectly. Everything is under control." But Marcus's version of control looked very different from what Rosa had built. Within a week of her hospitalization, he had instituted new efficiency measures that began systematically dismantling the personal relationships that were the foundation of Rosa's kitchen success. Maria's hours were reduced to part-time, ostensibly to prevent burnout during this difficult period. Her managerial responsibilities were transferred to corporate consultants who analyzed everything in terms of labor costs and profit margins. "We need to professionalize our operations," Marcus explained to the senior staff during a meeting that Maria was conspicuously not invited to attend. "My mother's personal approach has been wonderful, but as she ages, we need systems that don't depend on individual relationships." The translation was clear to everyone who understood corporate speak. The era of treating employees like family was ending. The new era would be about efficiency, standardization, and the kind of emotional distance that made difficult decisions easier to justify. Rosa returned home after 2 weeks in the hospital, her speech slowly improving but her left side still significantly weakened. She found her beloved restaurants transformed in subtle but unmistakable ways. The photographs of family and longtime customers that had decorated the walls were being replaced with generic Mexican-inspired artwork. The handwritten menu boards that had announced daily specials based on fresh ingredients were replaced with printed menus featuring standardized offerings. Even the music had changed, from the traditional mariachi and conjunto that Rosa had carefully selected to generic Latin jazz that offended no one and inspired no one. But it was the absence of Maria's constant presence that struck Rosa most powerfully. Her granddaughter by choice and blood was now relegated to part-time cleaning duties, her insights into customer preferences and staff management dismissed as anecdotal by the new consultants who measured everything but understood nothing. Rosa's discovery of Marcus's financial manipulations came through the kind of accident that feels like divine intervention. During her 4th month of recovery, while searching through her home office for insurance documents, she found a bank statement that had been misfiled behind other papers. The account number looked familiar, but the balance seemed impossibly high for what she remembered as a minor business account. Curiosity sparked by confusion, Rosa began a deeper investigation that revealed a pattern of financial transfers that made her blood run cold. Marcus had been systematically moving money from Rosa's kitchen operating accounts into investment funds that he controlled personally. The amounts weren't large enough to trigger automatic alerts, $5,000 here, $10,000 there, but over 3 years, they totaled nearly $400,000. The paper trail told a story of careful embezzlement disguised as strategic financial management. Marcus had created investment accounts using his power of attorney, justifying the transfers as protecting assets against inflation and diversifying the portfolio for tax advantages. But the accounts were in his name alone, and the investment strategy seemed designed more to obscure ownership than to generate returns. When Rosa confronted him, the conversation took place in her living room on a gray October afternoon, with the smell of Maria's pozole drifting from the kitchen where she was preparing Rosa's dinner. Marcus arrived in his usual expensive suit, carrying a leather briefcase that contained, Rosa assumed, explanations that would make everything reasonable. "Marcus," Rosa said, her speech still slightly slurred but her mind crystal clear, "I need you to explain these bank transfers." She handed him the statements she had discovered, watching his face for the flicker of surprise or guilt that would confirm her suspicions. Instead, she saw something worse, the calm composure of someone who had been prepared for this conversation. "Mother, I can understand why this might look concerning to you," Marcus said, settling into his father's old chair with the confidence of someone defending the indefensible. "But these were necessary moves to protect our assets." "Your assets?" "The restaurant business is volatile, and we needed to ensure that your personal wealth wasn't entirely dependent on daily operations." $400,000, Marcus. "Moved into accounts I didn't approve. In your name only." "Temporarily in my name, yes. For tax purposes and legal protection." "Mother, you have to understand, the business is worth $15 million now. $400,000 is less than 3% of your total assets. I was protecting the other 97%. Rosa felt something fundamental shift inside her chest, not the physical disruption of another stroke but the emotional earthquake of realizing that her golden child, the son for whom she had sacrificed everything, was stealing from her with the casual expertise of someone who had done it before. "Protecting from whom, Marcus?" "From me? From my decisions about my own money?" His mask slipped for just a moment, revealing the irritation of someone who resented having to explain obvious truths to someone too simple to understand them. "From bad decisions, yes. From emotional choices that prioritize sentiment over security. Mother, you've been giving money away for years, to David's rehab programs that don't work, to employees who take advantage of your kindness, to charities that accomplish nothing but making you feel good about yourself." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire that had been burning for years, finally visible. Rosa understood with devastating clarity that this wasn't sudden greed but the culmination of Marcus's lifelong belief that she was too naive, too generous, too ethnic to properly manage the fortune she had created. "And Maria?" Rosa asked quietly. "Is helping her also a bad decision?" Marcus's jaw tightened, and Rosa saw the truth in his expression before he spoke. "Maria is exactly what I'm talking about. You've elevated a housekeeper to a position of influence that undermines actual management. You've created dependencies that are professionally inappropriate and financially dangerous. When you're gone, who's going to explain to investors why we're paying family wages to someone who's not family?" "She is family, Marcus. She's the help, Mother. She's a nice woman, I'm sure, but she's not family. And treating her like family creates legal vulnerabilities that could destroy everything we've built." Rosa felt the walls of her carefully constructed world crumbling around her. Her son, her firstborn, her pride, saw her life's work not as a legacy to be honored but as an asset to be optimized. He saw her values not as wisdom to be preserved but as obstacles to be overcome. And he saw the people she loved not as family but as liabilities to be managed. Rosa's health continued its steady decline through 2016 and 2017, each small stroke and respiratory infection chipping away at her independence like waves wearing down a seawall. Marcus used each medical crisis as an opportunity to increase his control, always presenting his interventions as loving concern for her welfare. "Mother, you need professional care," he said during a particularly difficult conversation in early 2018, when Rosa's walking had become unsteady and her memory occasionally failed her. I've researched the best assisted living facilities in the area. Golden Years Manor has an excellent reputation, 24-hour nursing staff, activities programs. I want to stay in my home, Rosa interrupted, her voice carrying the stubborn authority of someone who had spent 70 years making her own decisions. It's not safe anymore. What if you fall? What if you forget to turn off the stove? Maria can't be here all the time, she has her own life, her own responsibilities. But Maria disagreed. When Rosa explained Marcus's pressure tactics, Maria's response was immediate and unwavering. I move in, she said simply. Isabella is grown, she has her own apartment now. You need someone here, and I need to be where you need me. The arrangement that followed was a masterpiece of quiet rebellion against Marcus's plans. Maria officially became Rosa's live-in caregiver, a position that came with a modest salary and enormous responsibilities. She managed Rosa's medications, prepared her meals according to strict dietary restrictions, helped her with physical therapy exercises, and provided the kind of emotional support that no professional facility could offer. More importantly, Maria became Rosa's eyes and ears in the business, reporting on the changes Marcus was implementing and translating the corporate doublespeak that had replaced plain communication. Through Maria, Rosa learned that Marcus was pressuring longtime employees to quit by changing their schedules and reducing their responsibilities. She discovered that he was courting potential buyers for the restaurant chain, describing his interest as exploring strategic options but clearly laying groundwork for a sale. The breaking point came during a staff meeting that Maria attended in her capacity as Rosa's representative. Marcus had invited executives from Heartland Restaurant Group, a corporate chain specializing in authentic ethnic dining experiences, to tour the restaurants and meet with management. During the presentation, Marcus described Rosa's kitchen as an undervalued asset with significant expansion potential that could benefit from professional management and standardized operations. The current model is too dependent on individual personalities and family traditions, Marcus explained to the corporate executives while Maria listened from the back of the room. Our customers want consistency and reliability, not folk stories and personal relationships. We need to scale the brand by eliminating variables that can't be replicated. Maria understood with crystal clarity that Marcus was describing the systematic destruction of everything Rosa had built. The variables he wanted to eliminate were the very things that made Rosa's kitchen special, the family recipes passed down through generations, the relationships with customers who had been coming for decades, the sense that each meal was prepared with love rather than manufactured for profit. That evening, Maria sat with Rosa in the living room that had been transformed into a makeshift medical suite, with hospital bed and monitoring equipment competing for space with family photographs and religious icons. She described the meeting in careful detail, watching Rosa's face as the full implications became clear. He wants to sell, Rosa said, her voice barely above a whisper. He wants to sell our family to strangers. Si, Senora. But not just sell. He wants to erase. Turn it into something that looks like what we built but has no soul. Rosa closed her eyes, and Maria could see her mentally reviewing a lifetime of sacrifice and struggle, all of it about to be reduced to corporate efficiency and standardized profit margins. When she opened her eyes again, her expression held a determination that Maria hadn't seen since the early days of her recovery. Call Eleanor Thorne, Rosa said. Tell her I need to see her. Privately. And Maria, don't tell Marcus. Christmas 2018 was Rosa's last, though no one knew it at the time except perhaps Rosa herself, who had been feeling the particular weariness that comes when the body begins its final negotiations with eternity. She insisted on hosting the family gathering at her home, despite Marcus's protests about the difficulty of accommodating her medical needs. The house was decorated with the same care that had marked Rosa's Christmases for 50 years, though now it was Maria's hands that hung the papal picado and arranged the nativity scene that Rosa's mother had carried from Mexico in 1920. The kitchen filled with the aromas of tamales and buñuelos, pozole and tres leches cake, all prepared by Maria under Rosa's watchful supervision. Marcus arrived with Celeste and Sophia, now 21 and home from Northwestern University, where she was studying international business with a minor in Spanish, a choice that had surprised everyone, particularly her father. David came alone, 3 years sober and working as a graphic designer for a small firm that specialized in restaurant branding. His latest project, ironically, involved helping family-owned restaurants maintain their authenticity while expanding their reach. Isabella, now 22 and working as a teacher in a bilingual elementary school, helped Maria serve dinner while Rosa held court from her wheelchair, directing the placement of dishes and the serving of traditional Christmas punch with the authority of a general commanding troops. It was during dessert that Marcus made his announcement, his timing calculated to catch the family in a moment of contentment and gratitude. "I have some exciting news to share," he said, standing with his wineglass raised in what looked like a toast. "After months of negotiations, I've reached a preliminary agreement with Heartland Restaurant Group for the acquisition of Rosa's Kitchen. The deal values our chain at $22 million, which represents a significant return on our investment." The silence that followed was deafening. Rosa's face went pale, her hands gripping the armrests of her wheelchair with what little strength remained to her. David's expression shifted from confusion to horror as he realized what his brother was announcing. Even Sophia looked uncomfortable, glancing between her father and her grandmother with the awareness that something significant was happening that she didn't fully understand. "Marcus," Rosa said, her voice carrying across the room with surprising strength, "we have never discussed selling the restaurants." "Mother, we've discussed this many times. You know that the business needs professional management to reach its full potential. This acquisition will ensure that Rosa's Kitchen continues to grow and prosper long after." He caught himself before completing the sentence, but the implication hung in the air like smoke. "Long after I'm dead," Rosa finished for him. "That's what you mean, isn't it? You've been planning my funeral before I've stopped breathing." Celeste reached across the table to touch Marcus's arm, a warning to proceed carefully, but he was beyond caution. Years of frustration and resentment had built to this moment, and the wine had loosened his usually careful tongue. "Yes, Mother, after you're gone. Because someone has to think about the future. Someone has to make the difficult decisions that preserve what you've built instead of watching it slowly decay under mismanagement and sentimentality." The words struck Rosa like physical blows. Her son, her golden child, her chosen heir, was not just planning to sell her life's work but describing her continued involvement as a threat to its success. Mismanagement? Rosa's voice was barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of decades of sacrifice and struggle. Sentimentality? You've turned a business into a charity, Mother. You've prioritized personal relationships over profit margins, tradition over growth. The investors see potential that's being wasted on. Marcus's eyes flicked toward Maria, who was standing frozen in the kitchen doorway, on people and programs that don't contribute to the bottom line. Rosa felt something break inside her chest, not physically this time but emotionally. The final illusion that her son understood or valued what she had built crumbled like old paper. He saw her heritage as embarrassment, her values as obstacles, her love as weakness. "Everyone leave," Rosa said quietly. "Except Maria. I need to rest." The dispersal was awkward and tense, with David helping his grandmother back to her room while Marcus gathered his family with the stiff dignity of someone who believed he had been wronged. As the front door closed behind them, Rosa felt the weight of a decision that had been building for months finally settling into certainty. She asked Maria to help her to the living room window, where they could see Marcus loading presents into his BMW while Celeste checked her phone and Sophia sat in sullen silence. The tableau looked like a Christmas card, but Rosa knew she was watching the end of her family as she had known it. "You understand what this all means, don't you, Mija?" Rosa said, her hand resting on Maria's arm. "They see business where we built familia. They see problems where we created solutions. They see the past where we planted the future." Maria nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Sí, abuela. I understand." Then you understand why I have to protect it. Why I have to make sure that what we built together survives what they would do to it. That night, as Chicago slept under a blanket of fresh snow, Rosa and Maria sat together in the quiet house, planning the salvation of a legacy that meant everything to one generation and nothing to the next. The will that Eleanor Thorne had quietly rewritten 3 months earlier represented more than just a transfer of assets. It was Rosa's final declaration that love, loyalty, and authentic legacy mattered more than blood, expectations, and corporate profits. The woman who had arrived in Chicago 53 years earlier with nothing but hope and determination was preparing to leave behind everything she had built to the one person who truly understood its value. Family, Rosa had learned, was not always about DNA. Sometimes it was about the choice to preserve what mattered most, even when that choice broke your heart. The silence in Eleanor Thorne's office had calcified into something almost tangible, a crystalline structure of shock that seemed ready to shatter at the slightest touch. Marcus stood frozen beside his overturned chair, his face cycling through shades of red and white like a malfunctioning traffic light, while Celeste gripped the table edge as if gravity itself had become unreliable. Sophia sat transfixed, her young mind struggling to process the magnitude of what had just occurred, and David remained motionless, watching his family's carefully constructed world crumble with the fascinated horror of someone witnessing a controlled demolition. Eleanor Thorne observed the tableau with the clinical detachment of someone who had presided over dozens of such moments, each one a small apocalypse in the lives of those who had mistaken entitlement for inevitability. She reached into her leather portfolio with deliberate care, extracting an envelope that bore Rosa's distinctive handwriting in fading blue ink. "Your mother anticipated this reaction," Eleanor said, her voice cutting through the charged atmosphere like a scalpel through infected tissue. "She left specific instructions for me to read this letter in the event that her decision was poorly received." The envelope was cream-colored paper, expensive but not ostentatious, the kind Rosa had used for important correspondence throughout her business career. Her handwriting on the address was slightly shakier than in years past, betraying the tremor that had marked her final months, but the letters were formed with the same careful precision that had characterized everything she did. For Marcus, when the truth finally comes to light, read the inscription in Rosa's elegant script. Marcus sank back into his chair, which David had quietly righted, his earlier volcanic rage now replaced by something that looked disturbingly like fear. For the first time in his adult life, he was confronting the possibility that his mother, the woman he had systematically underestimated and manipulated, had seen through his machinations with crystalline clarity. Eleanor broke the seal with the reverence due to last words, unfolding pages that crackled slightly in the winter air. The letterhead bore the simple inscription Rosa Maria Delacroix in embossed letters, beneath which Rosa's final message to her eldest son waited to deliver its devastating revelation. "My dearest Marcus," Eleanor began, her voice taking on the cadence of Rosa's speech patterns, as if channeling the spirit of the woman who had dictated these words during her final lucid moments. "If Eleanor is reading this letter, it means that my decision to leave everything to Maria has come as a shock to you. It means that despite all your intelligence and business acumen, you have failed to understand the most fundamental truth about the family you thought you knew." Marcus winced as if struck, but Eleanor continued without pause, her voice carrying Rosa's words across the decades of misunderstanding and willful blindness that had led to this moment. "Maria Elena Santos is not simply my employee, my friend, or even my chosen daughter. She is my blood, Marcus. She is the granddaughter of my sister Esperanza, the sister I lost to poverty and disease before I could bring her to America. When Maria arrived at my door 23 years ago, pregnant and fleeing violence, I saw not just a young woman in need but the answer to prayers I had been offering since 1965. The revelation struck the room like lightning, illuminating connections that had been hidden in plain sight for decades." Sophia's hand flew to her mouth as understanding dawned, while David's eyes widened with the recognition of patterns he had sensed but never fully comprehended. Celeste made a small sound that might have been a gasp or a sob, and Marcus simply stared ahead as if trying to process information that rewrote the fundamental equations of his existence. "For 23 years, I watched you treat your cousin with the casual dismissal you reserved for all the help, never once considering that the woman who raised your half-sister with more love and attention than you showed your own daughter might be connected to you by bonds deeper than employment. Maria is Esperanza's granddaughter, which makes her your prima hermana, your cousin by blood as well as choice. Eleanor paused, allowing the weight of revelation to settle over the room like snow covering familiar landmarks and making them unrecognizable. When she resumed reading, Rosa's words carried the accumulated weight of decades of observation and disappointment. But blood alone would not have been enough to earn my trust and ultimately my legacy. Maria earned that through 23 years of devotion that you, my son, never chose to offer. When you saw profit margins, she saw family recipes that carried the stories of our ancestors. When you saw inefficiency, she saw relationships that transformed customers into extended family. When you saw obstacles to expansion, she saw the very authenticity that made expansion worthwhile. Marcus's face had gone ashen, and his hands trembled slightly as he gripped the armrests of his chair. For perhaps the first time in his adult life, he was being forced to confront the possibility that his mother's judgment was not clouded by sentiment but sharpened by wisdom he had failed to recognize. You ask yourself now, I imagine, how I could give away everything you expected to inherit. But Marcus, you had already taken what was yours. Over the past 5 years, you systematically attempted to erase everything that made Rosa's kitchen meaningful. You tried to transform my life's work into a corporate asset, my family recipes into standardized products, my relationships into profit centers. Eleanor's voice carried a subtle edge now, channeling Rosa's pain and disappointment as the letter delved into the specific betrayals that had shaped her final decision. I know about the money you moved into your personal accounts, for $100,000 that you justified as asset protection. I know about the corporate buyers you courted without my knowledge, describing my restaurants as undervalued assets that needed to be liberated from family sentiment. I know about your plans to eliminate the very elements that made our food special, the daily specials based on fresh ingredients, the family photographs that told our story, the relationships with customers who had been coming for decades. Marcus closed his eyes, and for a moment he looked not like a successful businessman but like a child who had been caught in an elaborate lie. The careful justifications he had constructed for his actions crumbled under the weight of his mother's precise accounting of his betrayals. But most painfully, I know about your embarrassment. Your embarrassment over my accent, which carries the music of the home you never knew. Your embarrassment over our ethnic authenticity, which you saw as an obstacle to mainstream success. Your embarrassment over the very heritage that gave our food its soul and our success its meaning. The word struck Marcus with surgical precision, exposing the shame that had driven his transformation from Rosa's beloved son into her greatest threat. His embarrassment had been so carefully concealed, even from himself, that hearing it articulated with such clarity was like having surgery performed without anesthesia. Maria, in contrast, understood from her first day what you never learned in 45 years. She understood that Rosa's Kitchen was not just a business but a bridge between the world we left behind and the world we created here. She understood that our recipes carried not just flavors but memories, not just techniques but traditions. She understood that success without authenticity was not success at all but a form of profitable surrender. Eleanor's voice softened as Rosa's letter turned from accusation to explanation, from hurt to hope. I leave everything to Maria not as punishment for your failures, my son, but as protection for everything we built together in the early years, when your father was alive and you still believed that family was more important than profit. Maria will preserve what matters while building what's needed. She will honor our traditions while embracing necessary change. She will remember that food is love made tangible, that restaurants are communities made manifest, that legacy is not about money but about meaning. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the wind against the windows and the soft sound of Sophia crying. David reached across the table to take his niece's hand, offering comfort in a moment when all the family's carefully maintained relationships had been exposed as fragile constructions built on misunderstanding and false assumptions. If you choose to contest this will, Marcus, I have instructed Eleanor to donate the disputed portion of my estate to organizations that fight for immigrant rights and family preservation. This is not cruelty but consistency. If you cannot honor the immigrant story that created our success, then perhaps others will use that success to honor immigrant stories yet to be written. Marcus opened his eyes, meeting Eleanor's gaze with an expression that combined defeat with the dawning recognition of choices that could not be unmade. The trap his mother had set was elegant in its simplicity, challenging the will would not restore his inheritance but would transform it into a monument to everything he had tried to escape. I want you to know, my beloved son, that my love for you remains unchanged by my disappointment in your choices. You are still the baby I held during those first difficult years, still the boy who helped me serve tables when your father was sick, still the young man who dreamed of building something lasting and meaningful. That man is still inside you, buried perhaps under years of corporate thinking and social ambition, but not lost forever. Rosa's final words carried the weight of unconditional love tempered by absolute clarity about the consequences of choices made and opportunities squandered. Learn from Maria how to build without destroying, how to grow without forgetting, how to succeed without surrendering the very things that make success worthwhile. Family is not just about blood, Marcus. It is about choice, loyalty, and shared commitment to preserving what matters most. Maria chose our family every day for 23 years. I pray that someday you will choose to be worthy of the family name you carry. The letter concluded with Rosa's signature, written in the careful script that had graced thousands of business documents and personal notes throughout her remarkable life. Below it, in slightly different ink, was a postscript that carried the weight of final forgiveness. P.S. The recipes are in the safe behind my bedroom mirror. The combination is your father's birthday. Maria knows which ones are family secrets and which ones can be shared. Trust her judgment, it has always been better than mine. Eleanor folded the letter carefully, returning it to its envelope with the reverence due to sacred text. The room remained silent except for the sound of breathing and the distant hum of traffic 40 floors below, as if the entire city were holding its breath while the Delacroix family processed the complete reconfiguration of their understanding of themselves and each other. Marcus sat like a statue carved from grief and revelation, finally understanding that the empire he had planned to inherit had been built on foundations he had spent years trying to demolish. His mother's final gift was not money or property but the truth about what family really meant, and the devastating knowledge that he had failed to understand that truth until it was too late to matter. The silence that followed Eleanor's reading stretched across the mahogany conference room like the aftermath of an earthquake, when the shaking has stopped but the full extent of the damage has yet to be assessed. Marcus remained frozen in his chair, his hands gripping the armrests with such force that his knuckles had turned bone white, his face cycling through expressions of disbelief, rage, and something that looked disturbingly like the beginning of understanding. The rage came first, as it always did with Marcus when his carefully constructed world faced challenges he couldn't control or manipulate. But this time, the fury lasted only moments before collapsing into something far more devastating, the recognition that his mother had seen through every justification, every rationalization, every careful argument he had used to transform her legacy into his opportunity. She knew, he whispered, his voice barely audible above the wind rattling the windows. All along, she knew what I was doing. Celeste's response was immediate and calculating, her mind already racing through the implications of their transformed circumstances. The woman who had married into the Delacroix family expecting to inherit a restaurant empire now found herself married to a man whose inheritance had evaporated in the span of a single sentence. Her fingers flew to her throat, touching the sapphire necklace that she had assumed would be the first of many inherited jewels. "We can contest this," she said, her voice carrying the brittle authority of someone accustomed to getting her way through sheer determination. "There are grounds: undue influence, mental incapacity, the inappropriate relationship between an employer and employee. No court would let a fortune this size pass to family?" Sophia interrupted, her young voice cutting through her mother's calculations with surprising force. At 21, she possessed the moral clarity that often comes before life's compromises have worn down one's sense of right and wrong. Abuela explained it in the letter, "Mom. Maria is family. She's our cousin." The simplicity of her statement hung in the air like a bell tolling, forcing everyone in the room to confront the fundamental question that had driven Rosa's decision: what constituted family, and what obligations came with that recognition. David, who had remained silent throughout the reading, finally spoke, his voice carrying the hard-won wisdom of someone who had survived his own worst impulses. Rosa always said that family wasn't just about blood. She said it was about showing up, day after day, especially when showing up was difficult. His words carried an implicit accusation that made Marcus flinch. David had been the family failure, the son whose addiction and artistic dreams had disappointed Rosa's practical ambitions. But he had also been present during Rosa's final years in ways that Marcus, despite his geographic proximity and business responsibilities, had not. Maria showed up, David continued, his gaze fixed on his older brother with an intensity that made Marcus shift uncomfortably. Every day for 23 years. When Rosa was sick, when she was difficult, when taking care of her meant sacrificing her own opportunities. You showed up when it was convenient, when there were business decisions to be made or documents to be signed. As if summoned by the conversation about her character, Maria Elena Santos appeared in the doorway of Eleanor's office, her presence transforming the atmosphere from one of family conflict to something that felt almost sacred. At 47, she possessed the kind of dignity that came from decades of service performed not out of obligation but from love. Her dark hair was streaked with silver, and her face showed the lines of someone who had smiled more than she had frowned, despite circumstances that might have justified the opposite. Beside her stood Isabella, now 25 and radiating the confident composure of someone who had been raised to understand her worth. She wore a simple blue dress that complemented her teacher's salary rather than making pretensions to wealth she didn't possess, but she carried herself with the bearing of someone who had been loved unconditionally and raised to believe that love, rather than money, was the true measure of family success. Senora Eleanor, Maria said, her English still carrying the musical accent that had marked her speech for 30 years in Chicago, I came as you requested. Eleanor rose from her chair with the respect due to someone whose life had just changed irrevocably. Mrs. Santos, please, come in. I believe you know everyone here, though perhaps not in the context we find ourselves in today. Maria's eyes swept the room, taking in Marcus's devastated expression, Celeste's calculating coldness, Sophia's tearful confusion, and David's supportive nod. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone who understood that she was inheriting not just wealth but responsibility. I want you all to know, she said, addressing the family with the careful respect that had characterized her interactions with them for over 2 decades, that I never asked for this. Senora Rosa made her decision without consulting me, though I understand now why she felt it was necessary. Marcus managed to lift his head, his voice hoarse with emotion. She gave you everything. Everything I worked for, everything I planned for. How can you stand there and act like this is some burden you didn't want? Maria's response carried the gentle firmness of someone who had learned to speak truth without cruelty. Because it is a burden, Senor Marcus. You think wealth is freedom, but Senora Rosa knew it was responsibility. I inherit not just money but the obligation to preserve what she built, the recipes, the relationships, the reputation, the commitment to our community. I inherit the duty to make sure that Rosa's kitchen remains what she intended it to be, a bridge between worlds, a celebration of heritage, a place where food carries love from the kitchen to the table. She paused, her gaze settling on each family member in turn. I also inherit the responsibility to try to heal what has been broken in this family, if that healing is possible. Isabella stepped forward, her voice carrying the confidence of someone raised by women who understood the importance of speaking truth. What my mother is too polite to say is that Abuela Rosa trusted her with this because she knew Mama would do what's right, not what's profitable. She knew Mama would preserve what made the restaurants special instead of selling them to people who would turn them into something generic and soulless. Marcus's final attempt at control emerged as a desperate threat delivered through gritted teeth. I'll fight this. I'll tie this up in court for years. I'll prove she was manipulated, that she wasn't competent to make decisions of this magnitude. You'll spend everything on legal fees before you see a penny of that money. Eleanor's response was swift and definitive. Mr. Delacroix, I should remind you that any legal challenge to this will trigger the charitable donation clause. You would not be fighting for your inheritance, you would be fighting to give it away to organizations that support immigrant rights. Your mother was quite specific about this consequence. The trap Rosa had constructed was elegant in its simplicity. Marcus could challenge the will, but success would mean no inheritance for anyone in the family, while failure would simply confirm what had already been decided. The only winning move was acceptance, and acceptance required admitting that his mother's judgment had been sound, his own actions misguided, and Maria's worthiness unquestionable. Maria extended her hand to Marcus, a gesture that carried decades of professional respect despite the personal hurt his treatment had caused. I hope that in time, we can work together to honor your mother's legacy. Rosa's kitchen belongs to all of us, it's just that the responsibility for protecting it now rests with me. Marcus stared at the offered hand for a long moment, then turned and walked out of the office without another word, Celeste following in angry silence. But Sophia remained, crossing the room to embrace Maria with the spontaneous affection that had always characterized her relationship with the woman she now understood to be her cousin. The reckoning was complete. The empire Rosa had built had passed to hands that would preserve rather than exploit its treasures, protect rather than profit from its values, and honor rather than abandon the heritage that had made it meaningful. The family was broken, but perhaps, in time, it could be rebuilt on a foundation more honest than the one that had just crumbled. December snow fell gently outside the windows of Rosa's kitchen on 18th Street, transforming the familiar neighborhood into something that looked like a Christmas card painted by memory and hope. Inside, the restaurant hummed with the energy that had made it legendary, the sound of sizzling oil and chopping knives, the laughter of customers who had become extended family, the musical mixing of Spanish and English that created the soundtrack of successful integration. Maria moved through the kitchen with the confidence of someone who had finally stepped fully into her destiny, no longer the employee grateful for opportunity but the owner responsible for preserving and expanding a legacy. The changes she had implemented over the past year were subtle but profound: the restoration of daily specials based on seasonal ingredients, the return of family photographs to walls that had been sterile during Marcus's brief period of control, the expansion of the menu to include regional dishes from different parts of Mexico that told the broader story of immigrant experience. But perhaps most significantly, Maria had established the Rosa Delacroix Community Foundation, using a portion of the inheritance to create programs that supported newly arrived immigrant families with job training, English classes, and small business loans. The foundation operated out of a renovated space next to the original restaurant, where women who reminded Maria of herself 30 years ago learned skills that would help them build American dreams while preserving the cultures that gave those dreams meaning. Isabella had taken a leave of absence from teaching to help manage the foundation's educational programs, bringing her bilingual skills and natural empathy to work with families navigating the same challenges her mother had faced decades earlier. Watching her daughter thrive in this environment, Maria often thought of Rosa's uncanny ability to see potential where others saw only need. The legal challenges Marcus had threatened never materialized. His attorney, after reviewing the will and its carefully constructed protective clauses, had advised him that mounting a challenge would be both expensive and ultimately futile. The money Marcus had siphoned from the business accounts was recovered through civil proceedings that he was too emotionally devastated to contest effectively. Within 6 months, the legal fees and financial investigations had consumed most of his personal savings, forcing him to sell his Lake Forest home and move to a modest condominium that reflected his reduced circumstances more accurately than his reduced pride. But the family's story was not one of pure vindication for the righteous and comeuppance for the wayward. Life, as Rosa had understood, was more complex than simple moral equations, and Maria's stewardship of the inheritance reflected that complexity. David's transformation had been perhaps the most remarkable. With Rosa's financial support no longer necessary for his survival, he had found the motivation to build his own success. His graphic design work, specializing in branding for family-owned restaurants, had grown into a thriving business that allowed him to help other immigrant entrepreneurs tell their stories through visual identity. His art, now displayed in the Foundation's gallery space, captured the beauty and struggle of the American immigrant experience with a sensitivity born from his own journey through addiction and recovery. Sophia's evolution surprised everyone, perhaps including herself. After completing her degree at Northwestern, she had chosen to spend her summer working at Rosa's Kitchen, initially out of curiosity about her grandmother's legacy but increasingly out of genuine passion for the business. She brought fresh energy to the restaurant's social media presence and community outreach, while Maria patiently taught her the traditional cooking techniques that connected her to ancestors she had never known existed. "I understand now why Abuela was so protective of all this," Sophia said one evening as she helped Maria close the restaurant, her hands finally steady enough to properly fold the delicate paper napkins that Rosa had insisted gave each table a personal touch. "It's not just about food. It's about family and community and preserving something beautiful in a world that wants to make everything the same." Marcus's journey toward redemption had been slower and more painful. The humiliation of his public downfall, combined with the financial stress of his reduced circumstances, had forced him to confront aspects of himself that he had spent decades avoiding. A breakdown in the spring had led to therapy sessions where he slowly began to unpack the shame and resentment that had driven his transformation from Rosa's beloved son into her greatest disappointment. His first tentative step toward reconciliation came in the form of a letter to Maria, written after 6 months of therapy and delivered through Eleanor Thorne to avoid the appearance of manipulation. In carefully chosen words, he acknowledged his mistakes, accepted responsibility for his betrayal of Rosa's trust, and asked not for forgiveness, which he understood he had not yet earned, but for the possibility that someday he might be allowed to contribute to the preservation of his mother's legacy in some small way. Maria's response, after consultation with Isabella and careful consideration of Rosa's final wishes, was an invitation to volunteer at the Foundation's job training programs. Marcus's business skills, properly directed, could help immigrant entrepreneurs develop the financial management abilities they needed to sustain their American dreams. It was work that required humility rather than authority, service rather than control, and Marcus approached it with the careful dedication of someone who understood that redemption was earned through consistent action rather than dramatic gestures. The restaurants themselves had not just survived the transition but flourished under Maria's leadership. The authentic recipes that Marcus had planned to standardize were celebrated in food magazines as examples of immigrant cuisine that honors tradition while embracing innovation. The community relationships he had dismissed as inefficient became the foundation for a customer loyalty that translated into consistent profitability without the need for corporate expansion. On quiet evenings, when the last customer had left and the kitchen had been cleaned for the next day's service, Maria would sit in Rosa's chair in the office that now bore both their names on the door. Above the desk hung a portrait of Rosa that David had painted from memory, capturing not just her physical appearance but something essential about her spirit, the determination that had carried her from a Mexican village to Chicago business success, the love that had sustained her through widowhood and family disappointment, the wisdom that had recognized the difference between inheritance and legacy. "We did it, Abuela," Maria would whisper to the portrait, updating Rosa on the day's events, the Foundation's progress, the slow healing of family relationships that had seemed irreparably broken. "We kept it all together. We kept it real." The lesson of Rosa's final gift was written in every aspect of the thriving businesses and restored family relationships. True inheritance was not about wealth but about values, not about money but about meaning, not about ownership but about stewardship. The woman who had arrived in Chicago with nothing but hope and determination had left behind something far more valuable than a $15 million estate. She had left behind proof that love, properly directed and fiercely protected, could bridge any gap, heal any wound, and preserve any treasure worth keeping. In the kitchen where Rosa had first learned to cook for customers who became family, where Maria had discovered her own strength and purpose, where Isabella was now learning to carry forward traditions that would outlive them all, the real legacy lived on, not in bank accounts or legal documents, but in the daily acts of love made tangible through food shared with community, heritage preserved through careful hands, and dreams passed down like sacred recipes from one generation to the next. The snow continued to fall outside, covering the city in pristine white that made everything look new again, while inside Rosa's kitchen, the warmth of family, chosen as much as born, created a sanctuary where the past informed the present and the future remained bright with possibility. "To the women who choose grace over grudge," Rosa's plaque had said, "your story is just beginning." The story continued, written daily in acts of service, preservation, and love that proved the most powerful inheritance of all was the capacity to build something meaningful and pass it on intact to those who would cherish rather than exploit its treasures.